Evelyn Murren. I'm a lecturer in public health nutrition in the School of Public Health Physiotherapy and Sports Science. And I'm delighted this morning to be able to introduce to you Isabel Stanley. So Isabel is actually a former graduate of the BSc in Human Nutrition. She graduated in 2016. And she then went on and did a master's in nutrition for global health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's been doing some research with me as part of the joint program initiative in Europe within the 3-year policy evaluation network. And I think within that program of research, she has gained an interest in looking at food policy and food systems analysis in trying to understand the whole policy arena. And with that, then she applied for an Institute of Food and Health Strategic Support Scheme grant, which she was successful in last year. And so she is going to present to you today the output of that research, which is really looking at the Irish fruit and vegetable system. And she's scoping this research to try and continue it further as part of an IRC grant. So I will hand you over to Isabel now.
Yeah, everyone. So with the grant, we were hoping that we could kind of have a look at the Irish fruit and vegetable system and see look at the lay of the land and how it's working at the moment, to see kind of lay groundwork for future research and to see what transformations can be made to make the system more sustainable. So we know that fruit and vegetable consumption is good for both human and planetary health. Fruit and vegetables are an essential part of a healthy diet and an important source of vitamins, minerals, and fiber, and they provide multiple benefits and protect against non-communicable diseases, including cardiovascular disease and certain cancers. In fact, in 2017, 3.9 million deaths were attributable to insufficient fruit and vegetable intake. But fruit and vegetable consumption also plays a role in environmental health. Diets that are higher in fruit and vegetables are widely associated with increased sustainability. And also the production of fruit and vegetables plays a role in land use, water pollution, and biodiversity. These indicators, according to the EPA 2020 report, Ireland is falling behind on all of these environmental indicators. So it's important that we look at them and address and see how we can change production. So I'll start by looking at fruit and vegetable consumption. So this is far below the recommended intake of 400 grams per day as recommended by the WHO. The IUNA National Nutrition Surveys have estimated that average intake in adults in Ireland is 285 grams, adolescents 213 grams, and children just 222 grams. And then when we're trying to look at also what types, it's important to look at the types of fruit and vegetable that are consumed. The data on this is limited in Ireland. However, when we looked at the household budget surveys, we were able to look at the most frequently purchased fruit and vegetables. So in 2016, households spent an average of €15 a week on fruit and vegetables. I'm sure this has increased in the last 4 or 5 years. And of that, 11% was spent on carrots, 7% on bananas, 7% on soft fruit, and 6% on apples, apples. So to meet dietary recommendations, fruit and vegetable consumption in Ireland needs to increase considerably by about 40% in adults and 88 and 80% in adolescents and children. This could be done through policy actions promoting fruit and vegetables. They should be targeted at population groups with lower consumption rates and should specifically address barriers to consumption, including access, availability, and affordability. So this is what we know. So we know how much the population need to consume, but what is the Irish fruit and vegetable supply? So the FAO food balance sheets estimate the total amount of fruit and vegetables available. So they define it as human food before waste. And this includes fruits, vegetables, and the derivatives after processing. So for example, juices and prepared vegetables. Using FAO food balance sheet data, we estimated that in 2019, Ireland had 417 grams per person per day of fruit and vegetables. In Europe, that supply was 526 grams per person per day, and globally 607 grams per person today. However, just because the supply is there doesn't mean that it's available to the entire population. Due to their perishability, waste and loss of fruit and vegetables throughout the food supply chain is generally high. It's estimated that 40 to 50% of fruit and veg globally is lost or wasted. In Ireland, the EPA estimated that food waste in Ireland in 2019 amounted to 1 million tonnes. So not including waste, this isn't including waste from primary production. This estimate suggests that when you can take into account food waste, that actually our supply of 417 grams is probably below the recommended intake of 400 grams per person per day. Equitable access to the supply is also an issue. In 2020, between 20 and 28% of the cost of a healthy eating basket was attributable to fruit and vegetables. And we also need to consider the type and quantity of vegetables as they provide, or the fruit and vegetables provide different nutrients and the quantities of those nutrients. In our analysis, we were limited to the categorization by the FAO, but if you look at the diagram, there's a kind of a rough idea of the makeup of that 417 grams. So there's 40% vegetables, 13% fruits other, and then it's broken down further into oranges, which is 11%, bananas, tomatoes, apples, onions, grapes, and citrus fruits are the lowest. So where do we get this supply? As a small open economy with a mild climate, Ireland is naturally heavily reliant on imports for fruit and vegetable supply. The imports for fruit and vegetable supply have steadily increased over the last 60 years as domestic production has decreased. In 2020, 890,000 tonnes of fruit and vegetables were imported. This represented a 42% increase in total fruit and vegetable imports compared to 1992. The imports are made up of a mix of tropical fruits, field vegetables, apples, and soft fruits. So we get import 11% of total imports. 11% of total imports are for bananas, 6% oranges and mandarins, and then 29% is made up of seasonal imports of fruit and vegetables that could be grown domestically. So 18% potatoes, 5% apples, and 6% of soft fruits. So because we import so much, it's important to look at where we import our fruit and vegetables from, to look at how vulnerable our supply is. So Ireland imports from a total of 205 territories across the globe. So we wanted to look at how climate vulnerable the import countries were. And to do this, we used the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative. So they made vulnerability scores. These are based on vulnerability indicators across sectors with 3 component domains. So there's an exposure component, a sensitivity component, and an adaptive capacity component. And these are in across different sectors. So you can see here they have food, water, health, ecosystem services, human habitat, and infrastructure. So for example, the exposure component for food will be projected change of cereal yields, whereas the adaptive capacity component would be child malnutrition and agricultural capacity, for example, the supply of fertilizers, irrigation, tractor use, and pesticide. So to look under the Notre Dame scores, Ireland is classified as low vulnerability to as having low vulnerability to climate change and a high level of readiness and is well positioned to adapt to climate change. However, we import from many countries, so naturally the vulnerability scores across these countries will change. So we created tertiles of the vulnerability scores, and we classified all import countries into 3 categories, so low vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, and high vulnerability. So 7 of the 20 countries providing more than 1% of imports of fruit and vegetable to Ireland are classified as vulnerable. So you can see Peru, Brazil, Egypt, the Dominican Republic, South Africa, Belize, and Costa Rica. In 2021, 22% of total fruit and vegetable imports came from countries classified as climate vulnerable. This was a 44% increase in total tonnes compared to 2001. However, the largest proportion of imports come from European countries, in particular Spain, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. Great Britain was actually, up until Brexit, was accounted for 24% of total imports, but now after Brexit that reduced to 14%, and the Netherlands have taken up the top spot. When we look at the types of fruit and vegetables that we import from moderate to high vulnerability countries, that's 98% of our bananas come from countries that are classified as moderate or highly vulnerable. And then also a large proportion of our pineapples, onions, oranges, garlics, and leeks, and also 16% of apples, which was a surprising finding, I thought. So then when we look back at production, so in production in 2020 amounted to 61.8 thousand tonnes. This represented a 73% reduction since 1961. And 14% since 2010. In 2020, we produced 58% of our total production was potatoes. That was followed by mushrooms, carrots and turnips, cabbages and brassicas, apples, and soft fruits. So as well as the kind of the demand for more tropical fruits that we can't grow here, there are other threats to production that we're facing at the moment. As a result of external macroeconomic factors, the cost of horticulture production inputs for fruit and vegetables in Ireland has increased by an average of 13% in 2021. These are estimates that were put together by Teagasc. So this sharp rise in costs of inputs has put severe pressure on growers' viability, as it's difficult for them to pass on the increased costs through price increases, as if they're selling to supermarkets, the supermarkets don't want to increase the price either. Further to that, the pandemic has highlighted the need for a more resilient system with measures in place to ensure food and nutrition security and safety. This is particularly important for fruit and vegetables, as we mentioned before, they have a high perishability. So any delay in supply across the line, you're going to end up with a lot of food loss and waste. Restrictions put in place to reduce the spread of COVID-19 have impacted the provision of fruit and vegetables by causing disruptions throughout the supply chain. So this was kind of from primary production right through to retail. So there was reduced availability and delays in the delivery of agriculture inputs like seeds and machinery. There was seasonal labour shortages. So a lot of fruit and vegetable picking is done by migrant workers. So naturally when everywhere was locked down, that stopped. So there was a lot of kind of non-harvesting of crops, restricted transport for distribution, and this all led to retail shortages and consumer price increases. The sustainable production of fruit and vegetables requires a high level of knowledge, labour, technology and inputs, and this includes kind of high quality seeds, energy, fertiliser, crop protection products and growing media. So once there's disruptions to this or price increases, this has impacts across the entire chain. So in conclusion, current fruit and vegetable supply in Ireland is below what is needed to meet healthy eating goals. When we consider the future of fruit and vegetable supply, policies should consider and address the vulnerability of countries that support our supply and the sustainability of increasing domestic production. So strategies to address the vulnerability in the Irish fruit and vegetable supply could include investment into research and into horticultural expansion in Ireland. It needs collaboration and investment into the mitigation of climate change in agriculture in climate vulnerable countries. So we need to work with other countries to address this. Policies targeting food loss and waste across the system, including primary production, distribution, processing, retail, and at the household level, could also alleviate this burden. So reducing this waste can increase supply in a sustainable way by providing savings and allowing for the redistribution of food that would have been wasted. And finally, we need to look at how we assess food systems and look at the gaps in the data. So to move towards more sustainable and equitable food systems, there's a need for harmonized data to provide a clear picture of the current system, and also so that when policies are implemented to change the system, we need to be able to monitor and evaluate the policies. A linked trade, production and consumption database for Ireland would allow for a more accurate estimation of food supply. And the availability of regular consumption microdata would significantly help the development of targeted policies to increase consumption rates. So we used data from a mixture of data from the FAO and the CSO trade data. So by nature of we are kind of mixing and matching the data. So it's kind of an estimate and an idea of supply, but it's definitely not a totally accurate estimation. So having that data would really help in developing policies. And that's, if anyone has any questions, we've put together a policy brief. The QR code there is there if anyone wants to access it, and we'll try and circulate it as well. Thank you.